We're here with Scott McCleskey, Managing Editor for North America for Complinet, talking to him about his new book, When Free Markets Fail. Scott, tell us what the book is about.
Well, it's a layman's guide to the regulatory reform debate and what things like moral hazard or too big to fail are really all about. And it also makes the point that regulation is part of a free market. Free markets in the real world do fail, and that regulation is necessary in order to actually keep them from taking the economy down with them.
Why did you write it, and who was it written for?
Well, there are already a lot of good books out there that are a play-by-play of how the crisis happened, what happened to Bear Stearns or to Lehman Brothers. I wanted to put out a book that that looks forward and talks about how are we going to fix the system. And I think it's important that the book be written for people that actually have a stake in what happens. And by that I mean you and me, people who aren't necessarily involved in day-to-day operations of the market. We have an interest in it and we want to know what goes on. And I think that that's important for everybody, because at the end of the day, this is very much a pocketbook issue, and people ought to, they should not be leaving it all to the pundits. They should have an understanding of the debate themselves.
You came to some conclusions about regulatory reform in the book. What are the most important?
I think the most important one is that markets have gotten too complex to regulate themselves. We're past the stage where people at the firm can know everything that's going on in the markets, and so there is an important role for regulation, and I think that needs to be borne in mind as we go through this debate. I think another important conclusion is that when we talk about things like too big to fail, we have to concentrate on keeping the problems from becoming systemic, and that means it's all very well to say if a bank goes under, it ought to go bankrupt, and that kind of feeds our sense of justice. But in reality, what you need to think about is how to keep these failures from becoming systemic. So when, for instance, Bear Stearns started to fail, the government intervened and said, we'll support some of the short-term debt. If you don't do this, then nobody wants to trade with Bear Stearns or anybody else who might trade with Bear Stearns, and the whole thing goes systemic. So I think that we need to bear that in mind and not just say we should take these firms and let them go bankrupt. And I think the last point is that we shouldn't think just in terms of organizations. We talk about bankrupting the organization and this thing called moral hazard, which is the theory that if you support a failing bank, then all the other banks are going to think there's no consequence to taking risk. It's largely an academic idea that has been swallowed whole by the policymakers. But when you think about it, it's people that make decisions, not organizations. So what you really need to concentrate on are measures that will have real negative consequences for management, and not necessarily take out the whole organization, because when you do that, you're affecting employees, you're affecting creditors, and you're affecting the entire economy, and we may not want to do that.
And you received some press earlier this year with the proposal in the book to reform the way regulators are staffed. What is it that you propose?
Yeah, I think the problem that I have here is that as we look at the proposals that are coming out of Congress, they make this assumption that if we create a new regulator for consumer protection, or if we create transparency in a $600 trillion credit default swap market, then the regulators will step up and do their job and do it effectively. Well, they didn't do that before, and I don't think that we should expect them to do it any better when we add an entire market bigger than the GDP of planet Earth. And the problem that we have is essentially turnover at places like the SEC and some of the other regulators. They're not keeping their people. You wind up with, well, look at the Madoff scheme. You wind up with people who don't really know what they're looking at. They may have a law degree or whatever. And so what I proposed in this editorial in the New York Times was to create a career management system similar to the U.S. Foreign Service. People in the Foreign Service could leave at any point and make more money, just like a lawyer at the SEC. What keeps them there is early eligibility for retirement, career tracks that are very well defined with training and promotions and experience that gives them expertise in a single field, and the Foreign Service Institute, which is there to provide induction training and follow-on training throughout their careers. And since it takes people from all over different agencies, it also provides a mix of experience so that people can pick up the phone and call somebody they know in another agency. And that would also address this silo problem within the SEC and some of the other regulators where nobody's talking to anybody else. So what I propose is to do something similar to the Foreign Service for the regulatory agencies. Not to create a new agency, but to manage careers so that people have a reason to stay.
What do you think about the direction of financial reform? Would it prevent another crisis?
Well, I think that where we are with financial reform right now is the end of the political phase of the process. And this regulation is, in the beginning anyway, very much a political process. And that means that what we have now is what is politically achievable and not necessarily what will be the best regulatory outcome. And we'll have to see when it's actually implemented. But to answer your question, no, this won't prevent another crisis, but then again, nothing really can. And it would be dangerous to think that there's some silver bullet out there, such as keeping banks small, that will prevent a crisis. We need to do things like that, but we also need to operate on the assumption that, like all good crises, the next one will come from a direction we're not anticipating now. And that's why we need a plan B, which brings us back to what I had said earlier, that the government needs to be able to intervene to stabilize the system, even if it means that temporarily we are, quote, bailing out a bank.
Well, thank you, Scott, for talking to us today about your new book, When Free Markets Fail.
Thank you.